Hello everyone, it's me Uncle John. Today I'm going to read S4 4086 Part C, Climate Change, Chapter 8. Is it all bad? Is climate change bad for everyone? The short answer is no. If you live in a cold country, the winter will be warmer than before. The plants in your garden and the food in your shops will be different, but you will still have a garden and you will still have food. It will not be like this for everyone. Many people will not be able to change as quickly as the climate. Think about animals and plants. How quickly can they adapt to a new climate? In our places, there will be more dry days and less rain. The IPCC report says that food production in these places will go down by 5% during the 21st century. But in the colder places, there will be more warm days and more rain. The growing season, the time of the year when plants can grow, will be longer than before, and plants need CO2. More CO2 is good for them. The IPCC report says that food production in the US and Europe will increase by 5% during the 21st century. So climate change will be good for farmers in colder countries, but it'll be bad for farmers in hotter countries. When the Arctic ice melts, it is bad for many people around the world. But in some ways, it is good for the countries nearby. Russia, the US, and other Arctic countries want the oil and gas that are in the ground under the sea, and it'll be much easier to get them when the ice has melted. Without the Arctic ice, it'll also be much easier for ships to travel across the world. But there are many other changes that are not so good. The world is becoming warmer, and plants and animals must either adapt or die. In Vermont, in the northern United States, the winter has become warmer and the growing season is longer. That's not so good for maple trees, which give us maple syrup. Maple trees need both a cold winter and a warm summer. Now they are not doing well in Vermont, but they are doing well further north in Canada. For maple trees, like so many other plants and animals, the climate is now better in the north. The melting ice in the Arctic is not so good for some animals. Polar bears can run on the land and swim in the water, but they need the ice when they hunt for seals. These animals live in the sea, under the ice, but they make holes in the ice to get air. Polar bears wait near these holes and catch the seals when they come up for air. But in the summer months, when there is a little ice, the bears cannot hunt like this, so they don't eat. And now the summer is getting longer, the earlier months longer than before. Scientists think that we will lose 30% of our polar bears in the next 50 years. Many strange things happen because of climate change. When the sea gets warmer, turtles have more female eggs than male eggs. Nobody knows what will happen in the future. Perhaps turtles will adapt to warmer seas, or perhaps there will be fewer and fewer male turtles. In Britain and the Netherlands, there are birds called tits that eat caterpillars. This is a very important food for them when they have their young. The caterpillars become butterflies. This is beginning to happen earlier in the year. So when the baby tits need food, there are no more caterpillars for them to eat. The food has flown away. Each of these is a small problem, but many small problems make one big problem. The IPCC report says that about 25% of all plants and animals are in danger if the temperature increases by more than 2 degrees Celsius. Animals and plants take a long time to adapt, sometimes thousands of years. People can adapt more quickly, but are we ready to do this? Chapter 9. Carbon. The Earth is getting warmer and the level of CO2 in the atmosphere is rising. At Mauna Loa in Hawaii, the levels of CO2 in the atmosphere have increased from 315 parts per million in 1958 to 380 ppm today, and the increase of CO2 is getting larger each year. In 1975, we put the gigatons of carbon into the atmosphere. In 2008, we put more than 7 gigatons of carbon into the atmosphere. Where does it all go? Life on Earth needs carbon. There is carbon in the air, the sea, and the ground. When we burn coal and oil, we put carbon back into the air. as carbon dioxide. When we burn wood or cut down trees and other plants, we put carbon back into the air. But when a plant is growing, it takes carbon out of the air. Every year, the level of CO2 in the atmosphere goes up in the autumn when plants are dying, and goes down in the spring when plants are growing. Because of this, the large forests of the world are very important. They take CO2 out of the air. Plants have a lot of carbon inside them, and the world's large tropical forests have nearly half of the carbon that's in the world's plants. If we cut down or burn the trees, their CO2 will go back into the air, and there will be fewer trees to take CO2 out of the air each spring. We put carbon into the air, and about 25% of it moves from the air into the sea. About 30% goes into the land, plants or trees. The other 40% goes into the atmosphere, and it stays there for a long time. But why is the level of CO2 increasing? We burn coal and oil to make energy for our factories, offices, and homes, and for cars, trains, and planes. This makes about 75% of the carbon that goes into the atmosphere. The other 25% comes from the land. Everywhere in the world, people are building houses, offices, and roads, and cutting down plants and trees. And when plants and trees die, the carbon goes back into the atmosphere. This is where the carbon comes from. But who is putting it there? Each person on Earth puts 4,600 kilos of CO2 into the atmosphere each year. But of course, this is not true. Developed countries put more greenhouse gases into the atmosphere than the underdeveloped countries. And many countries are developing very quickly. When they develop, they use more energy, and they put more greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. For many years, the U.S. has put about 20% of the world's greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, which is a higher level than any other country. But now, China is putting in about 20% too, and China is growing very quickly. Many countries need to develop, and they need to use energy to do this. In 2006, International Energy Agency asked itself this question: how much energy will all countries use in the year 2030? The answer they think is 100% more energy than we use now, and developing countries like China and India will use 70% of that new energy. This is a global problem. It's not easy to find answers, but people have started looking for them. In the next chapter, we'll look at some of these answers. Chapter 10, what are our governments doing? The IPCC looks at problems, finds answers, and writes reports, but it cannot decide what to do. Governments have to decide. In 1992, the UN had a meeting in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, called the Earth Summit. Here, the countries of the UN looked at the first IPCC report and agreed to work together. They made a new group, the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, and they asked this new group to make a plan for their fight against climate change. At the group's third meeting in Kyoto, Japan, in 1997, the UNFCCC made its plan. It is called the Kyoto Protocol. In the Kyoto Protocol, each country has a limit to its greenhouse gases. Each country that agrees to the protocol says that it will not put more greenhouse gases into the atmosphere than its limit. Nearly all the countries in the world have agreed to be at the UNFCCC meetings, but only 178 countries have agreed to the Kyoto Protocol. And it did not start until 2005. And the US, one of the biggest producers of CO2, has not yet agreed to the protocol. Will the Kyoto Protocol be the answer to our problem? Scientists think that we need to reduce CO2 by 60% if we want to stop dangerous climate change The Kyoto Protocol will not reduce CO2. If all countries agree to the protocol, CO2 will continue to increase, but more slowly than before. So the Kyoto Protocol is just a start. What do we need to do next? There is no quick or easy answer. To give the poorest people of the world a better life, countries need to develop. That means using more energy. So we must learn to use energy differently. But while we are learning to do this, the earth will get warmer. So we must also change our way of living. Our climate is going to change. If we want to live, we must change at the same time. Countries all around the world are beginning to make changes. Hammarby, Storstad, a part of the city of Stockholm in Sweden, has homes for 25,000 people. These homes use half as much water and energy as other Swedish homes. Half of the electricity is made using the rubbish and dirty water that comes from people's home. In Australia, droughts have been a big problem in the 21st century. So at Kwinana, near the city of Perth, they have built their first desalination plant. This is a factory that takes the salt out of seawater and produces fresh drinking water. This produces 17% of Perth's drinking water, and the energy for the plant also comes from the wind turbine. So some countries are beginning to make changes, and they are using energy differently too. But how can we reduce our greenhouse gases? We are making 7 gigatons of carbon a year now, and in 50 years' time, we will make 14 gigatons of carbon a year. We need to reduce our carbon by 7 gigatons just to stay at the same. It's a very big problem. But in 2004, two scientists from Princeton University called Stephen Pacala and Robert Socolo had a good idea. Don't think about climate change as one problem, they said. Think of it as 15 problems with the 15 answers. Because we know 15 ways to reduce carbon. We can take 7 of those answers, and for each answer, we must reduce carbon by 1 gigaton. If we do this, we'll stop the problem. Many people like this idea. It helps us in 3 ways. Firstly, we can measure the problem and the answer to the problem. Secondly, we can decide how to change. We don't need to change everything. And thirdly, we know that the answers are possible. They are possible because they are 7 small answers, not one big answer. And that's because we are doing many of them already. For example, we are getting energy from wind turbine, from the sun, and from plants, and cutting down fewer trees. Governments are beginning to work together. They know that they must do something, but it'll be difficult for them to decide which answers to use. What can we do to help? Chapter 11, what can you do? We need to reduce billions of tons of carbon, but one person makes just over 1 ton a year. So what can a single person do? First, you can find out more. This is a short book. I can only tell you a little about climate change, but scientists are learning new things about the climate all the time. When you know more, you can ask yourself 2 questions. Is climate change an important problem? Do I want to do something about it? If you can answer yes to these 2 questions, then you have already started to do something about it. You have started to change yourself, and that's the first thing to do. Carbon footprint calculator. Next, you can start to change other people. This is not as hard as you think. If you talk about climate change to your friends, then you will help them to change themselves. And if everyone talks about climate change, then our government will want to do something about it. You can also help with the workup groups like Greenpeace and Friends of the Earth. Perhaps there are groups near you that are fighting against climate change. But you can do more than talk. You can change your way of living. Ask yourself, how much carbon do I put into the atmosphere? You have to measure many things: your travel, your food, your clothes, your telephone, and everything in your home. And you must not forget the very big things. To come and build a road, or your supermarket brings food from a long way away, this increases your carbon footprint. Carbon footprint. 잠시만. 들어와. 선생님 녹음하니까 조용. In the US, 11 tons in the UK, 8 tons in Spain, 4 tons in China, 1 ton in India. Nearly 30% of this comes from travel, 20% from the home, 5% from food, and the rest comes from things like making clothes and building roads. It's interesting to measure your carbon footprint, but it's more important to reduce it. Easiest way to reduce your carbon footprint is to use less energy. We use most energy either in the home or for travel. Think of all the things in your home, like TV, computers that use energy. Do you always turn them off when you're not using them? Do you use them more than you need to? Think about when you travel. Do you use a car more than you need to? Think about buying food. Does the food come from somewhere near to you or from a long way away? People always say that climate change is a global problem, but it's also a local problem because we can all do something about it. And we can start in our home. It is hard to change our way of living and working, but change is like traveling on a long journey. You start in one place and you finish it in a different place. Perhaps reading this book is the start of a journey. The end.